You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Well, it's my privilege and John's to introduce our special guest host today on the Final Say Radio Show. David A. Keene is, he's a giant in the conservative movement, but he's really a giant in the media and in all the circles in Washington, because he's done so for so many decades. He's worked so hard on so many different areas, whether it was with the American Conservative Union, heading that up for many years, or being the president of the National Rifle Association, and now he is the opinion editor with the Washington Times. And he's been a good friend of ours and a good friend of the program. David, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today, and I want to thank you so much.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Well,
I don't know
David,
that introduction. It's just evidence that I've been around a long time and can't hold on to one position.
Well, no, actually, you've made such a great contribution, David, and that's it's to be respected and to be honored. To be honest with you, because John and I have had the pleasure of going to so many different CPACs and meeting so many great people, and just the work and effort that you guys put into that every year is an accomplishment in itself, and bringing together so many great minds and so many great people and Americans from all over the place. And then, of course, the NRA, John and I always say, without the Second Amendment, we don't have a First Amendment.
That's exactly right. Of course, they're trying to just directly take the First Amendment away from us right now. They're going to have hearings in the Senate, I think tomorrow, on whether or not they should amend the First Amendment to take away the right of Americans to engage in free political speech.
And that's just crazy talk.
It is crazy. It's not going to pass because it would have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, which is not going to happen. But it's interesting that United States senators, Democratic, liberal, or as they like to call themselves, progressive United States senators, would actually be willing to publicly discuss gutting the First Amendment of the Constitution, and think that that's something that is not only worth doing, but that would perhaps get them political support if they did it.
I think it's a very interesting change how that is. It's almost come full circle, or half circle, if you will, because if you go back to, say, the 60s, where it was all about freedom, like everybody wanted to be liberated and be able to state their claim and state their peace of mind, and now it seems the same people, now that they've grown up, are looking for the exact opposite type of thing. And I think
now they're all for regimentation. They're all for a society in which everyone else does what they think everyone else ought to be doing. Everything from what they say, what's politically correct, to what they eat, as Mrs. Obama wants to force on the school children of America, even though they're rejecting it. So it's a question of a desire to force people to live in the kind of society that they think would be better for us. It's not that they want to create a worse society. They actually believe that they know what's better for everyone else than everyone else knows for themselves.
Well, if we learn nothing from Jonestown years ago, it's always fear those who are pouring the Kool-Aid and willing to drink it themselves.
That's exactly right. It's really interesting, because if anyone threatened actions against them, that progressives are threatening against others, they'd be the first to be screaming and yelling and trying to shield themselves with constitutional guarantees. But since it's them trying to tell other people what to do, they don't have any problem with that.
Well, that's true. There was no shortage of crying executive fiat foul when George Bush was in office. And quite frankly, many of us who would consider ourselves true conservatives felt that there was way too much big government occurring at that time, and we were hoping for a pullback from that.
Well, that's exactly right. And on some of these questions of the post-9/11 period, when we went into a desire to maximize security, even at the potential expense of liberty, I remember I was critical of much that was going on because I thought the administration under George Bush had gone too far. And I remember standing up at one of these groups that consisted of people on the right and the left, all supposedly concerned about these things. And I said, I'm willing to stand here and criticize a Republican president, but I would wonder how many of you are going to stand up when you have a president of your own who's doing the same or worse. Are you going to let partisanship trump your concern about individual freedom and the Constitution, or are you going to stand up and criticize one of your own? And, of course, very, very few of them are willing to do that.
Well, and if they do, it's only because the pollsters tell them in the final moments that they should. David, as a kind of follow-on to Brett's lofty but well-earned introduction for you, I want to say I think yourself and many of your contemporaries are owed a debt of gratitude, because what you've taught us is something that people really need to understand. Conservatism, like life in general, it's not easy. Being a conservative is actually more difficult because it means we have a dedication to a set of principles, and no name pun intended, but we have a keen sense of right over wrong, of self-control over tyranny, of loyalty over coercion. And I think that's critically important, and it's why conservatism is, in my opinion, always at risk, because it's a lot easier to be the party of, yes, we can do whatever the heck you want, as opposed to the party of, no, that's not the right thing to do. We need to earn our keep, and we need to have a sense of dedication to this country and the set of principles that this country stands for.
That's exactly right. A conservative has to be willing to stand up and say no, even when what is desired to be accomplished is a good thing. In other words, sometimes it's as important to figure out how you get someplace as to where you want to go. We see this in particular now in the Obama administration, where some of the things that he wants to do people might agree with or disagree with, but he wants to short-circuit the entire system that was set up by the Founding Fathers. It wasn't set up fleetingly. It wasn't set up without much thought. It was set up because in order to maintain individual freedom, you have to be able to say no. And the Constitution is mostly about saying no. It's not about empowering. It's about limiting power. And when you're involved in the day-to-day activities, and when you come up with some idea that you think is great for everybody, it's very easy to get frustrated by those kinds of restraints on activity. Presidents always chafe at the inability to do exactly what they want to do in the way they want to do it at the time they want to do it. But very few of them have, like Barack Obama, very few of them have mused that they'd really like to be able to govern America like the Chinese govern China, where they don't have to worry about all these checks and balances, where you can just do what you want to do because it's good for everybody. Well, the people who put together the Constitution that has allowed this country to exist for as long as it has, as the freest country on earth, did so because they knew that no leader, no matter how well motivated, should be allowed to just do what he or she wants to do whenever they want to do it and in whatever manner they want to do it. They knew that freedom depends on protecting minorities as well as majorities, and that if the individual was going to survive and if the individual was going to be able to thrive in a free and civil society, there had to be limits on what the state and what his neighbors and the majority could do to prevent the freedom that makes this country possible.
See, now that's just poor antiquated crazy talk.
Pardon?
David, if we can, when you look at the Obama administration as compared to some of the more recent administrations, I think every administration has at least a small scandal, but I can't think of another administration that has had this many scandals, but which are significant. You add on top of all the foreign policy, I guess you can call them blunders, but significant issues abroad as well. And I think it's, and I'd also just like to add, it seems to me like they absolutely have no idea how to handle any of these situations outside of these are the 3 steps that we're going to take to try to brush off every one of them.
Yeah, you have in this administration a sort of weird combination of ideological drive combined with incompetent execution. So even those people who support what the president might want to do are awed by his inability to do even that. In the foreign policy arena, and most Americans in normal times don't spend as much time as some of us do in looking at what's going on in the world, but the fact of the matter is that America and our foreign policy is in a shambles. And I wanted to, as I was getting ready to call you today, I read, of all places, the Washington Post, which has spent most of the last 5 or 6 years applauding Barack Obama and applauding what he's done. Today, after his speech following on his visit to Afghanistan, and then with the speech at the West Point today, did an editorial called "The Retreat Continues," and he of course said that he was going to withdraw from over time and have all of our troops out of Afghanistan by the time he leaves office. And let me just read a little bit from this editorial. It's important not just because of the substance, but from whence it comes. It says, "You can't fault President Obama for inconsistency. After winning election in 2008, he reduced the U.S. military presence in Iraq to 0. After helping to topple Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, he made sure no U.S. forces would remain. He has steadfastly stayed aloof, except rhetorically, from the conflict in Syria." That's changing, of course. "And on Tuesday, he promised to withdraw all U.S. forces from Afghanistan by the end of 2016. The Afghan decision would be understandable had Mr. Obama's previous choices proved out, but what's remarkable is that the results have also been consistently bad." They go on to say, "For years, the United States promised to be a partner to a democratic Afghanistan, to help ensure that girls can keep going to school and to lock in the gains that have been won at such high price by U.S. and NATO troops. Mr. Obama's implicit message Tuesday was not so much. If al-Qaeda can just wait out the United States, it may get another chance. If Afghans have thrown their lot in with Americans, they will be left on their own." It says, and it talks about what they're doing, and it says, "It may be a year from now that reducing the troops by half or even withdrawing them all seems a wise and prudent option. But why not examine conditions then and make a decision based on facts? Instead, an administration that faulted its predecessor for being ideological seems to have substituted ideology for reality-based foreign policy." That's the Washington Post on Barack Obama's foreign policy, which tells you that it must really be bad before they recognized it. And domestically, every one of his programs, we as conservatives disagree with the underlying assumptions on which Obamacare is based. But if you set that aside and then look at the implementation of the plan, you find out that it was ideologically conceived and incompetently executed and rolled out. And that's case in almost every one of these areas and every one of these programs. It's remarkable. The only thing that the administration, other than its, as the Post points out, its failed foreign policy that's been consistent on, is how it handles these scandals. First of all, of course, the president announces that he read about it yesterday in the newspaper. He didn't know anything about it. I remember when Fast and Furious took place, which was the program under which the administration was actually running illegal guns into the Mexican cartel wars. The president said, well, how would he know what was going on? It's a big government. You can't keep your eye on everything, which he obviously doesn't. Now, most recently with the VA scandal, or if you go back to the IRS and all of these things, the president says, well, I just learned about this, and now we're going to look into it. And then they look into it, and then they study it, and then he says it's just a political attack by the Republicans. It's their fault, or it was George Bush's fault. And then after a while, when more facts come out, as they now come out on Benghazi, the administration says, well, this is an old story. You know, this happened some years ago, and what does it matter now? So they've been consistent in that regard, but that's their only consistent kind of tack that they take, and it is not a tribute to the rest of us that the public seems to have accepted that in many cases, but I think the public's getting tired of it.
I think you bring up a very good point. You know, we very often point out on this show that among our biggest failures in this administration is a complete and total lack of strategy, let alone no execution plan, metrics for success, or taking responsibility for failure, which is what you're just speaking to. And we get a lot of rhetoric, and while there's no substance behind it, and it's great. All that rhetoric is basically, Jay Carney producing lots of emissions without at least the benefits of energy production. But if you think about his "we learned it from the media" card, which is played, it's just wearing out the soles of those shoes. The question here is, how often would we just excuse this as a lie, which is the best we could say about it, or in reality, this is executive malpractice. And I think maybe what we're seeing in the Post editorial is that they're realizing at some point people have to wake up and put their country first.
Right. No, and it is malpractice. It's professional malpractice. Take the VA scandal, which is not going to go away. It's real. It's been there for a long time. The Veterans Administration hospital system has really faced the same kind of challenges back during the Clinton years, the Bush years, and now into the Obama years. And in each case, whoever's been appointed administrator has been unable to do anything to fix it. Which is one of the reasons why the argument about whether we fire the Secretary of Veterans Affairs and replace him with somebody else is an argument that will have, in fact, little impact on the future service or the future services that will be provided to American veterans. The difference, though, is that this president in 2007 attacked the Bush administration for its failure to fix the VA. And now, when it gets worse by several magnitudes, and it turns out that the people at the VA who work there don't regard veterans as their customers, as the people that they have to please, but their bureaucratic superiors, so that they shun aside the needs of the people that was supposedly their mission, and instead make things up and keep a separate set of books and do anything to make their superiors happy. The president says, we just learned about this by reading it in the newspaper, but he was talking about it in 2007. And then he and his spokesman say, well, it was George W. Bush's fault because he took us into these two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that had just flooded the system with veterans. That's when you start getting into the area of untruth, because in fact only 7% of the patients in VA facilities are patients with a record in Iraq and Afghanistan, and only 4% of the money that's spent in the VA system goes to those patients. The patients served primarily by the VA are veterans of earlier wars and earlier conflicts. So, and yet there's this attempt to say, well, it wasn't me, I didn't know about it, and it was really my predecessor's fault, even though I ran against my predecessor saying I was going to fix it. So when you put it all together, you say, now just a minute, how can all of these things be true? And I wrote earlier this week, I said, either based on what he said in 2007 and 2008, the president tried to fix it and failed, or secondly, he didn't try at all. And we know it's the latter rather than the former. And then when the chickens come home to roost, he announces that he didn't know anything about it. And it was something that he read in the newspaper, when in fact he had campaigned on solving the problem, and worse than that, he'd been on the Veterans Affairs Committee in the United States Senate, and very rarely as a senator even bothered to attend a committee meeting. So this is a president who really believes that the only thing that's important is making the speech. You remember back when Obamacare was developed, it was really developed by these progressives in the Senate and the House who put it together. The president said, go ahead and do it. And then when he was questioned while it was being developed by Paul Ryan and others in open fora, he didn't really know what was in it. He's not a detail guy. He's not a tree guy. He's a forest guy. He said, well, I want this healthcare system. Go put it together. And then when questions were raised, he said, well, I really didn't know that. And he said that about everything all the way through. So we've got a president who is basically a speechifier and not an executive. And so regardless of whether one agrees or disagrees with the substance of his speech, those speeches are not connected to reality. We saw that in the speeches this week on Afghanistan and at West Point. You know, it's interesting that one of the things they did was they revealed the identity of the CIA station chief, and they, to the government's credit, they did announce today that their Justice Department is opening up an investigation because this is about 10 times as dangerous a revelation as what they were trying to track down when they went after Bob Novak and others, and ended up getting Vice President Cheney's assistant Scooter Libby a jail sentence for the Valerie Plame affair some years ago. This guy was actually a station chief with his family in a foreign country under dangerous circumstances. She's someone who once had been active in other countries, but was actually working at a desk in the CIA when her name was revealed. So, and it doesn't seem to bother him, even though it was done during his visit to Afghanistan. He was involved in it. It wasn't him. It was somebody else. Somebody must have given him the name by mistake. You know, this is a guy who lives by the speech. He lives by the word. He doesn't live by the deed.
But he's still ultimately responsible, very simply because he's the executive, and all executives are responsible for the failure.
That's exactly right. And the problem, the political problem, and the managerial problem we have is that the public has been willing to let him off the hook on these things. Interestingly, there was a poll last week on the VA, so nobody blames Barack Obama for it. Well, he's the guy that was going to fix it. He's the guy that appointed an aide of his to do it. He's the guy that now says he didn't know anything that was going on. That is directly traceable to his talent as an executive and a manager, and that's what you judge a president by, not just his speeches.
Yeah. I'd like to add another lack of critical management skills in a particular area. When you look at NASA, you know, we've seen the space shuttles become museum pieces, and then we hear the announcements that we're going to pay the Russians to send up our astronauts to the International Space Station. Now you have a situation unfolding in Ukraine where after we've announced our sanctions, Russia's response is that, well, we're not going to participate in this international space system with you anymore. And we're left without any possibility of, until we advance in the private sector, new systems to put men in space. I mean, this is crazy what's going on.
That's exactly right. I mean, we abandoned that and we decided to simply rent Russian missiles to take our people up. And that worked as long as we were getting along with the Russians. But it doesn't work if you're not, because they are their missiles, you know. So,
you know, I also go ahead, Brett.
I'm sorry. I also wanted to add something to what you were talking about with the VA and also with Afghanistan. I think what makes it more significant with the outing of the CIA station chief is the fact that this is our one and only war right now. I mean, it's our biggest, or at least the biggest part of our war on terrorism, and it is more significant than any other location. Almost as if, like, now, I'll just compare it. They recognize that they messed up so badly in Benghazi that they've sent the Marine contingency and the ship to Bataan to potentially help everybody leave Libya now in case they have to.
You're right.
And it's just them showing the card that we know we really messed up and we're not going to do that again.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the problem with Benghazi, I think people miss the underlying problem, and that is that I think this is the first time, certainly the first time of anything of this magnitude in the history of the United States where we just left our troops, left people out there, and didn't make any attempt to get them out of harm's way. And that has really hurt morale within the U.S. military, because the one promise we've always made our soldiers and Marines is that you will not be left behind, and yet we left them behind. And that's the real question. What policy decision was made that allowed them to do that? And that's what it's all about. It's not about who was watching television or what was the president doing in this period. Why wasn't the order given to get our people out?
I'm glad you bring that up. And before we switch further into foreign policy, I want to kind of close out on the VA thing. I think it's part of what's so despicable about the entire behavior that we've seen under this VA scandal is the fact that these people essentially were left behind after they survived and made it home.
That's exactly right. You know, the VA and the underlying problem with the VA and the reason it hasn't been able to be fixed, you know that the VA is the largest employer in the federal government, over 350,000 employees, a budget of almost $60 billion a year, a budget that's been growing rapidly while the caseload has actually been dropping. And the conundrum that the progressives find themselves in is that it wasn't but 2 or 3 years ago that they were bragging that the Veterans Administration system was the model for the single-payer health care program that they wanted to adopt for the entire country. Paul Krugman constantly was pointing to the VA as a system that works, that in the medical care and health care system, competition does not work. Others were saying the same thing, and that this was what we should all want and what we should look forward to. And what it is essentially a Soviet-style medical system. And in such a system, the customer, in this case the veterans, really has little say or is of little concern to the bureaucrats who are really interested in how they're graded by superior bureaucrats. And there's no way other than fiat rationing, which is what was being done in Arizona and Chicago and elsewhere, to decide what you're going to do. So that veterans, it sometimes took veterans that wanted to go through the system or that stuck with it, it took them a year to get eyeglasses, which is why a lot of younger veterans and those who aren't willing to put up with that sort of thing, and anybody who can afford it, will just go to Walmart and buy glasses. They're not going to put up with all of that. The stories are so many that anyone had to know, and there have been report after report about these waiting lines and the danger of these lines, and we're not providing care to many of our veterans. You know, there are a lot of doctors within that system who are very good, and the defense of the system is, well, once you get in, the treatment is pretty good. Well, that doesn't help you if you can't get in, and it's something that's been promised to you. Ollie North, Lieutenant Colonel Ollie North, said last week, why don't they give them a card? And if they can't get in, they can go anywhere they want, get the treatments they need, and then the VA can reimburse the private provider. Why not do that? Isn't that better than letting people die because the lines are too long? And in fact, I talked to a senator who had previously chaired the committee in the Senate, and he said actually he believed that if we gave every veteran a medical health credit card with no limit that allowed him to take care of his health care needs, close down all the veterans hospitals and all of this, that you'd probably save a lot of money and provide much better care to everybody. Now, that's not going to happen because of the strong lobby in favor of these things. And whenever you've got something that exists in 50 states with facilities and 350,000 employees and all of the attendant suppliers and contractors, that system is not going to be replaced, but it certainly can be reformed.
And, you know, if the back of that card just had a simple statement that said, please spend wisely, your children and grandchildren will pay this bill, I think you're right. I think they would take a lot of responsibility there. You know, I want to point out one final thing in there. And by the way, kudos to your article, David Keene, in the Washington Times. I learned a few new things myself in there, including the absolute scale of the VA monstrosity or bureaucratic monstrosity itself. One of the things I do want to point out before moving off this topic, though, is this was bad under Clinton, worse under Bush, and magnified exponentially worse under Obama. But I want to point out, during that same time, advances in technology should have vastly improved the efficiency of delivery for services, the accuracy and transparency of record keeping, et cetera. And so to the Obama loyalists, this is a shining daylights. Light is shining light on something is always the best disinfectant. You've heard various aspects of that phrase, and this should be a giant billboard to Obama loyalists that say, do you, even yourself, do you really want to entrust a single-payer giant government bureaucracy that would conduct such a broken system to take care of your life, your body, your wife, your daughter, your son, your children, your parents, etc.? I think this is this may be the play that ends up win over Benghazi and other important issues might be the thing that actually could turn the election and turn people against Obamacare.
Well, I think that very well could be. The Republicans right now, as they edge toward the 2014 elections, are debating whether Obamacare or the opposition to Obamacare has run its course, or whether that's what they should focus on. My own feeling is that people have made up their minds on Obamacare, and they need to be reminded every once in a while, but they don't like it now. They didn't like it when it was passed. They're not going to like it when they cast their votes in 2014. And this is, in fact, right there in front of everybody, showing them what their future could be like. It's interesting because not talking just about Obama followers. In recent days, one of the problems that the Obama Democrats face is that young people who were so overwhelmingly for him have been deserting him in hordes. And if you look at the VA, I talked earlier about how a lot of the Iraqi and Afghan veterans are not using the VA. Now, some of that's because they're younger and they don't have the medical needs of older veterans, but it's also because young people won't put up with that kind of thing. They're the ones who, if you tell them it's going to take 3 months, they're going to go out and get it done somewhere else at reasonable cost. They're folks who aren't going to wait for a year for eyeglasses. They're going to go down the street and get them in a week or less. So I think that what this is in reality a stark example of what an old top-down command structure does in the modern world. It doesn't adjust. It isn't able to serve customers. It isn't able to serve individuals. It forces the managers to treat people in groups and say, we're not going to see these people. I can tell you a personal story. My daughter served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, and one of her friends had been injured and was at Walter Reed, and he came out of the coma, but the fellow next to him didn't come out of the coma. And what they do then is they put they diagnose you as being in a persistent vegetative state. They take you out of the service, put you into the VA system, and send you to a hospital or a warehouse where they keep these people, expecting them never to wake up. My daughter's friend woke up while he was at Walter Reed, and has since been rehabbed and down in San Antonio and is doing fine. The other fella was taken out of the service, was shipped off to a VA facility in North Carolina, and woke up. And at the time I said, that's when he stopped being a hero and started being a problem. Because his wife said he has to go back to Walter Reed or someplace where they have therapy. The military, Pentagon, and the people that run that said, well, he's not in the service. He's the responsibility of the VA. And the VA said, well, he needs to go to the facility closest to his home. They don't have those kinds of services there, so tough luck. We got the chairman of the Senate committee, the senator from his state, and another senator at the time, who's now the Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, who was very interested in Veterans Affairs, to go to the VA and tell the general in charge of this thing that this guy had to be taken care of. And they wouldn't do it, even though they had the authorizing committee chairman there and all of the rest. And he said, but don't worry, this doesn't happen very often. And I remember Chuck Hagel said to him, well, if that's the case, it ought to be easy to fix. And they said, well, no, we're not going to do that. They're not responsive to individuals. They're responsive to bureaucratic rules and mandates, and that causes a problem for individuals when they run up against that system. So everybody that's dealt with it at the governmental level, in the Senate, in the executive branch, knows there's a problem, and nobody's been able to do anything about it thus far. And it's a shining or stark example to anybody who looks at it what can happen when you decide to take something like this out of the market, out of the private sector, and put it into the hands of a top-down bureaucracy in the government. There are a lot of people that work at the VA who are really good people. It's not their fault. It's the system in which they find themselves enmeshed.
And that's the case for many of these agencies. When you look at education, for an example, it used to be that a lot of the states or even cities became very creative in the methods that they set up to try to improve their educational system. And it wasn't just a matter of throwing more money at a problem. It was a matter of coming up with different methods of teaching, changing the size or the location or the makeup of the classroom and the way they,
exactly right.
the methods. But what was important was you have 50 different states that had a different method. And so when you see the introduction of something like Common Core or a federal top-down program like you're referring to with the VA, you take a situation where you no longer have the competition between states to come up with creative programs.
No, that's exactly right. One of the, it's almost trite, but one of the reasons, one of the strengths of the federal system, as they used to teach you in school, was that there were 50 laboratories. Mm-hmm. And in something like education, that means you got 50 chances to get it right. If you make that decision in Washington alone, you only got one chance to make it right. And if you mess up, then it's wrong for everybody.
And they don't get it right too often.
No, that's exactly. And also the further away. And think about this. When you look at the education system, it's no longer, because of the bureaucracy, it's not about the kids. It's about the teachers. It's about the administrators. It's about the bureaucracy. And the kids are the ones who suffer. You look at the VA, it's not about the patients. It's not about the veterans. It's about the people within the system and their superiors in the system itself. One of the things that's happened is not only is the administration attempting to blame it on George Bush and Iraq and Afghanistan, which is not true, but also you've got people like Bernie Sanders from Vermont, who is a socialist, saying the problem is that we haven't given the VA enough money. In fact, they finished this year, I think, with a surplus of something like $500 million because they can't spend all the money they've gotten. Congress of both parties has voted them all the money they've requested in every appropriation cycle in recent memory, and it isn't that they don't have enough money to devote to the problem. It's that the system and the construct that they're operating with can't deliver on the promise or on the mission for which it was formed. And instead of analyzing its inability to deliver, we do as a society what we do in a lot of areas, which is say, well, let's just put more money into it. And that's what's happening. That's what happens in all of these areas. And and politicians tend to judge other politicians' commitment to an issue simply on the basis of how much money they're able to vote. So if you're pro-veteran in Congress, you're expected to vote more money for the VA. When they've got more money than they can use already, and they're wasting it and using it wrongly and not serving the patients that's their mission to serve. If it's education, you do the same thing. If it's the Pentagon, you do the same thing. If you're a conservative, if you're a liberal, it's HHS. You just keep giving more and more money to programs that may or may not work, and we don't do the real hard look at what the government is capable of doing and not capable of doing, and decide on the priorities that will allow government to do the things that it can do well and get out of the way of the private sector in those areas where it's just not competent to handle the problem.
Well, David, you need look no further than out your window of the Washington Times offices to appreciate the absolute waste that is the roughly $30,000 per student being spent in the D.C. school district. And I think, as you clearly pointed out, if you want to separate conservative, and I don't really see Republicans because many Republicans are failing and becoming Democrats light, but if you want to separate conservatism from progressivism, you could simply say that progressives measure things based on total spending and how many people are receiving those services. I'll have to refer to them as takers, versus conservatives who would look at it more from a perspective of milestones and performance. And if you look at it from that perspective, you'd have to look at almost all of the government programs as significant failures. Most would be not just an F, but they might be an F to the point of a 10, 15, 20, or 30, not even a 59 where you might have a chance with one good test grade on your finals to pull it over the line. And then we're being asked to trust government, in the case of something like Obamacare, to literally own own our life and death decisions, to own our bodies. It just seems insane to me. I find it shocking that so many people are so willing to be complicit to this, government takeover of virtually everything.
No, that's exactly right. And even though the evidence, and this is why it's ideologically driven, because the fact of the matter is that the evidence is there. I was president of the National Rifle Association. I had a news producer say once, you've got all the empirical evidence that you need to demonstrate that you're right and the other guys are wrong. For example, in the last few decades, every state in the country now, to one degree or another, has passed a law that allows citizens, honest legal citizens, to possess and carry a concealed firearm. And in every state where those laws have been proposed and ultimately enacted, there's been a debate, much of which is now in the archives and in video archives, of politicians saying, if you pass this law, violence is going to increase. There are going to be gunfights at intersections. There are going to be gunfights in bars. All of these things are going to take place. And yet in every single jurisdiction, gun violence has decreased after the passage of concealed carry laws for a very simple reason, and that is that criminals don't know who's got a firearm and who doesn't, so they have to have another thing go through their mind before they commit a crime. But that evidence doesn't change anyone's mind on the other side because they're ideologically driven. They say guns are bad. So we've got this situation with this multiple killing in California, where the fellow used a car, a knife, and a gun, and he's a crazed gunman, and yet he killed more people with a knife than he killed with a gun.
This fellow also has a mental problem, not a
that's the
problem.
real problem. But it's not. None of these things are evidence based. So if you look at the VA, the idea that you would allow competition, or that you would allow the kinds of things that have produced the best medical system, healthcare system in the world, be utilized for veterans, is something that a progressive can't accept, because the progressive knows that A, the profit motive is bad, B, that the best way to get good government is to get everybody marching in the same direction and being shepherded by people who know better what they need than they possibly could know, and that would be the folks who are in the government itself. And so evidence doesn't affect them, because they have a vision of a society that's very different from the vision that conservatives have. Conservatives view liberty and freedom as incredibly important goals. The progressive doesn't, and suggests. So when you talk about freedom, he talks about community. When you talk about liberty, he talks about equality. And it's almost as if you're living on different planets. And the two are just simply, at the extremes at least, not compatible.
Well, because you're right, it's the rational brains versus the emotional brains. And David, unfortunately, the emotional brains have a much better use of words. I mean, they're definitely winning in the word category. There's three categories or three subjects I want to cover, and we're already running fairly long into the show. So first, I want to just boil your blood slightly. I'm not sure if you've seen this, but in the interest of the Second Amendment's, in quotes, shall not be infringed, did you see Rahm Emanuel's goal today of saying he wants, the mayor of Chicago, of course, that he wants to require all gun sales to be videotaped? I wonder if we agreed to that, if they said we can videotape all practices with the exception of inside the medical room itself at abortion clinics. You think they would consider that acceptable?
No, they wouldn't. I'll tell you. All of these things, if you buy, first of all, it's very difficult to buy a firearm in Chicago anyway. If you buy a firearm at a dealer, and that's where 98% of firearms are purchased, you undergo a background check. Now, it is against federal law to keep a registry of firearms owners. In other words, when you undergo that background check, what's called the National Instant Check System run by the FBI, you go in to Walmart, which is the largest seller of firearms in the country, and you want to buy an AR-15 in the states where that's legal. What they do is they call in all of the databases, the relevant databases are scanned by computer, and it comes back and says Rappaport's okay. Then you're allowed to buy the firearm. And that record under federal law has to be destroyed so that it can't be used to compile a national gun registry. After that law was passed, the NRA had to go to court because the Justice Department was maintaining it anyway, contrary to the red letters of the statute. We had to go to court and get the court to tell them, no, you got to destroy those records. If you don't pass the background check, if you're a felon or something, then, of course, they can keep the record. That's different. Everything that Rahm Emanuel wants to do, that the United States Senate wanted to do, was to find a back door to putting together that kind of a federal gun registry, which would prevent no crimes, but would give the government a lock on which citizens own firearms all over the country. There are a couple of dangers with that, of course. One is that's the first step to confiscation. The second one is what happened in New York, where somebody got into the system and just publicized who had firearms and who didn't. And all of these things which are contrary to federal law and are bad policy. When the NRA opposed what was called the Manchin-Toomey Amendment, as you'll remember last year, which would have required background checks on virtually all purchases, we opposed it on the basis of the way it was written. It would provide a back door to setting up a gun registry. The President of the United States, in public, accused us of lying. The American Civil Liberties Union looked at it and came out and said, well, the President's actually wrong. The NRA is right on this. We don't need any more databases in this country where we're categorizing people and keeping lists of who has what and who does what. And that's really what Rahm Emanuel is now trying to find, is a more high-tech way to get into it and provide that kind of a gun registry. At the NRA, we've opposed that. The Congress opposes it. The Senate opposes it. No matter how many backdoor attempts they make, we're going to do what we can to prevent it.
Now, isn't this a perfect transition into the whole NSA and the spying issue, right? You have to ask yourself, and you guys had a nice article today about Snowden, but you have to ask yourself, as Americans, do we just sit back and accept the inevitability of this Orwellian reality we've waken up to, so that we feel more secure? Or do we need to demand that we take our liberty back, understanding that there are implied risks with that? Because the evidence, as we've seen, you just pointed out, and there's endless cases. And, of course, if there was one positive side effect of Snowden's treason, and I believe 100% it was treason, is that we can't really trust our own government with that information. And, giving up our liberty doesn't actually seem like it's going to make us safer, but we may never get that liberty back.
Well, that's the problem, is that when you give up liberty, you rarely get it back. It's a little bit like a ratchet, and much of in this we've gone in every lifetime, in every time we've faced particularly international but also domestic threats. The government has been there to say, we can protect you better, if you just give up this a little bit more liberty. During the First World War, Woodrow Wilson, the original progressive, enacted the laws under which Snowden would have been prosecuted, for example. As originally drafted, those laws not only were designed to punish anybody who spoke against the government. And Woodrow Wilson had over 100 reporters jailed. He had Eugene Debs, who had been a socialist who'd run against him, locked up for 10 years. For what? For being a terrorist? No, for criticizing him. And when he was finally defeated by Warren Harding pardoned all of them, said this is not a country where people are sent to prison for what they say, and had a dinner for him at the White House. But that law remains on the books. Then we had World War II. We had the same sort of thing. We had the internment of the Japanese. We had the Cold War and problems there. And now we get into today where the problem is terrorism. And the guy that I liked to watch during this whole period, and you're right, Snowden broke the law doing what he did. But the guy that was freed by this was Ron Wyden, the senator from Oregon, who sat on the Intelligence Committee and for years had been vaguely warning that the government was doing things that shouldn't be doing. And when the Snowden stuff came out, it was like he'd been freed, because now he'd, of course, been sworn to secrecy because he was on the intelligence committee. Now he could talk about it. And he could say, look, they're doing these things that they sit in front of us and deny. It was Ron Wyden who asked Clapper under oath before the Senate if they were keeping records, domestic records on Americans, and he said, and tapping their lines or collecting their data, and he said no. And Wyden looked at him, and he knew he was being lied to, because he had a briefing as intelligence committee member in which they admitted they were doing it, but they weren't willing to admit it in front of the American people. And he had provided that question to Clapper in advance, in writing, and then after he committed perjury, had resubmitted the question to him and said, do you want to alter your answer for the record? And he said no. So unfortunately, the only way a lot of this stuff got out was because of what Snowden did. But now that it's out, and the slogan is what was it, that the NSA has know everything about everybody, and they really do want to collect everything. Pardon?
I'm sorry. I wanted to add three quick points here. One is, if in Snowden's shoes, if you're a true whistleblower, you don't run off to first Hong Kong, then China, then to Russia. Of course, Vladimir Putin loves being able to say, hey, he's living happily in our nation. But Snowden has gone a long way to hurt the trust that we have with nations such as Germany and Britain and France and others.
Right. And arguably, that's where he did the damage.
Yes.
Had he limited himself, let's go back for a second, because under the Wilson laws from World War I, it is virtually impossible for anybody who has revealed what's classified information to be acquitted. So had there is actually no defense, which is what they would have prosecuted him under. So you can understand his willingness his desire to get out from there. And previous whistleblowers at the CIA and DIA have been treated very, very badly by the government, because these agencies, want to maintain their secrecy, for legitimate and illegitimate reasons. But then, having done that, had he simply told publicly what the NSA is doing illegally in the United States, that would have been one thing. But what he's talked about internationally, first of all, is not illegal. It may be, it may be bad manners, but it's what nations do, as they listen to each other and they try to get as much information as they can. That's really hurt the United States' standing and the United States' ability to collect intelligence. What we're doing in the United States is a whole different question, and is something that a whistleblower needed to come forward on.
But he should have come forward to someplace like the Washington Times, right, or to a reputable media outlet. David Keene of the Washington Times, thanks so much for joining us. We are going to try to schedule some more time with you, because we absolutely love you having on the show. You have so much wisdom to offer, and of course we expect all of our listeners to buy and or online tune in to the Washington Times, and where they can get some more of this wisdom. Again, David, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, David.
Well.